Therefore, he is relatively safe. And the question is, do we have sexual selection as humans are concerned? If we look at humans around the world and humans that have been around for a while, it seems that there is some degree of sexual selection. There are select things that people find attractive. One good example is the lip plate that the Ubangi maintain. Of course, that makes them attractive. It's not very functional. Obviously, it's not very functional. It's a big plate. So how in the world do they eat? It's their bottom lip. Of course, without the plate, the males don't find them attractive. So the bigger the plate, or the fact that you have a plate, the more likely you are to get married, I guess, I don't know, and have children. The Chinese, for some reason, they really find small feet attractive, or they did. This is when they bound feet. When the English got over there in the 19th century, they kind of stopped this practice. They said it was barbaric. But as you can see, here's this lady with almost no feet whatsoever. Her feet are so tiny. But this is what they did. They bound the feet and they curved the toes underneath to make the feet as small as possible. And even today, if you go to China, if you go to Japan, you go to China, not Korea. Koreans have fairly large, flat feet. But if you go to China, you go to Japan, their feet are tiny. Despite the fact they're not binding them anymore, they're just little bitty things. And of course, if we look at, and I'll tell you what, this is something that I've noticed with American Indians. You guys have kind of small feet too. Yes, you do. as compared to, I got size 12 feet. Size 12. If you look at basketball players, there's the guys that are 6'4", 6'5", and they have size 12 feet. And here I've got size 12 feet. What the hell's going on? Are you closing your ears so you can't?
Oh, my ears.
You're warming your ears up. Okay. Don't tell me. Okay. Once upon a time in the northern plains, the mountain people used to flatten their heads. And that's one of the reasons why they called them flatheads. And even to this day, if you go to the just south of Glacier is the Flathead Reservation for the Salish and Kootenai. There's some Nez Perce there, and some Coeur d'Alene are there as well, Pend d'Oreille. But they used to flatten their heads, and the way they did it was by putting they put a board on the baby's head, and it shaped the head. When I was in South America, I saw this as well down in South America with the Inca and the Moche and all those individuals in that area. They had dug up skulls that were mal-shaped. Well, they were mal-shaped not because of a disease, but because that's what they did to the head, trying to make them more attractive, or they found this more attractive. I can remember one in a museum that was shaped like a heart. The skull was shaped like a heart. They had put something, they bound the middle of the skull and separated it into two hemispheres, two sections. And I know, and I've got a picture of that, and I need to remember to get it. I got it in Iowa. Anyway, flatheads. That's confusing. Of course, Europeans aren't immune to these stupid ideas. These individuals wanted the smallest waist possible. Yeah, Aaron's here, of course. Wonderful. Oh, you know what? Okay. Anyway, they wanted the smallest waist possible, so they would cinch up this part of their body, and of course, they're forcing all of their organs above it, and it actually gave them larger looking breasts. They didn't actually have larger breasts. What they had were all their organs were shoved up into their thorax rather than where it's supposed to be. As stupid as that is, I know that's one of the dumbest things. And this is scarification, of course, people scarring themselves, mostly for identification, tribal identification, but also for beauty. You know, what do we do for beauty? And the pygmy, of course, is the guy on the left. The guy on the right is actually a Cherokee Indian. As you can see, he's about 2 feet taller than the pygmy. He's over 6 feet tall, and the pygmy is right around 4 feet tall. So you can see he's like half a human, the pygmy is. But of course, in his area of the world, which was the rainforest of Nigeria, the Congo, that area, the rainforest, the smaller you were, the more likely you could survive. You would need less food for one thing. But you'd also be able to sneak around in the forest without running into something, you know, knocking your head on the way or something. Anyway, we see the same thing in the Philippines. Small populations of individuals are able to survive. Were you ever in the Philippines? Did you go to the Philippines? No. Okay. They call these individuals negritos. They're tiny little guys. They carry poison darts, just like the pygmies of Africa do. Everybody's afraid of them. You can't hear them. What they do in the Philippines is they hire these guys to guard their properties. And of course, if you've got one of these guys guarding your properties and somebody tries to break in, they die because these guys will sneak up behind them and slit their throats or shoot them with a poison dart. Really kind of interesting. This is a Samoan. As you can see, he's tattooed his face. And of course, everybody has a different facial tattoo, and it makes him more attractive. Obviously, he's more attractive because of his tattoos. These ladies have elongated their earlobes. And as I said last time, I have a nephew that did this. And eventually he stopped, and as you can see, they've got something hanging from it to keep the earlobes distended. Their earlobes go all the way down to their shoulders, as attractive as that is. This is what it looks like, somebody without it, without distended earlobes. Sexual selection, what different people find this attractive. These are the mountain women of Thailand. And as you can see, they're making their necks longer and their ankles more attractive. This group doesn't have the ankle bracelets, but there are some that have ankle bracelets that go all the way up into their calf. And what it does, it pushes their calf up. But what the neck rings do is that pushes down the clavicle, pushes down the shoulders. They don't really have longer necks. Their necks are the same length as anybody else's. It's just that their shoulders are farther down. It pushes everything down. And these are the Maasai, the Dinka, very slender men of the Kalahari Desert. Jumping is what makes them attractive. So the higher they can jump, the more likely they'll get to find a girlfriend. Women choose men by how high they can jump, and of course, the more slender you are, the higher you can jump, and that's exactly what they're doing. As you can see, one of I think you can see, yeah, he's got one leg farther down than the other. So what they do is, when they jump, they will lift their leg. It's kind of like swinging. You kind of throw yourself. Well, they do the same thing. When they jump, they raise their leg, and the higher they jump, of course, they get just a couple more inches by popping their leg up, and that's what he's doing, popping his leg up. I don't know, I've never tried it before, but then again, I'm not tall and slender like he is. These guys are 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", pretty tall people. This is another group. These guys are nomads of the Sahara Desert. And women choose them by their ability to move their eyes independently. So normally if you look to the left, both your eyes look to the left, or both your eyes look to the right. But these guys can actually move their eyes independently. And that's what women find attractive. So what do we do in the United States for beauty? Well, one thing is we pierce ourselves. We pierce ourselves. And tattoo our faces, evidently. And that's a guy. Wait a minute, I got his girlfriend right here. There she is. There she is, okay. And I thought, I think I've got this picture in here. So I had a student once upon a time, about 2 years ago, and she had her cheeks pierced, which I just found, everybody found it a little odd. There she is right there. She's relatively attractive, but she wanted to, I don't get it. I didn't get it, and I never really asked her about it. She also puts on a lot of makeup. When she doesn't have her makeup on, she doesn't look the same. She's really kind of interesting. She's Hispanic, obviously. She's Hispanic. Interesting lady. She wants to be my fourth wife. She's volunteered to be my fourth wife. She's kind of funny. She's almost exactly 1/3 my age. So she's like 22 and I'm 68. 23. She's 22, 23 years old. She doesn't really want to marry me, obviously. She just finds me funny looking, I think. Anyway, this is a selfie that she took of us just before the school closed. She was a sophomore at that time, and she just graduated from ISU, Iowa State University. So she had to go to another institution. She missed me desperately. She used to write me letters and say, these guys are boring. They only talk about one thing at a time, and you always talk about lots of things and make us think. So she was kind of pissed off that I wasn't a teacher anymore. Anyway, okay, so adaptations, understanding the phylogeny of species allows us to study the behavioral and neural adaptations that allow animals to exploit particular ecological niches. And this is what we're looking at. You know, if you look at a wolf or you look at an elk in this area, what allows them to be the major grazers in this area, the elk, if it weren't for humans, yeah, the bigger horns, the larger size. If you've got a herd of elk and a herd of deer, who's going to win out? And the answer is, of course, the elk, probably, because they're much larger than the deer. It's not like the deer and the elk are going to fight each other. But the elk are larger animals, and they're going to eat more of the food. Another good example are canines. Wolves are, well, you don't have wolves down here. Well, I guess you do to some extent. But if you have coyotes, right? There are coyotes down here. You probably also have foxes to some extent, a small amount of foxes. Foxes and coyotes fill the same niche, but they eat different animals. The coyotes will eat rabbits. They will eat some rodents, but foxes, that's all they eat are rodents. So the more mice you have, the more likely you're going to have a healthy population of, and prairie dogs. You guys have prairie dogs, don't you, down here? Prairie dogs are really hard to catch. I don't know if you've ever tried to chase one, but they're really hard to catch. Mice are a little bit easier because you can dig them out, but a prairie dog digs really deeply, so unless you can catch one out, they're really hard to catch. Anyway, so as far as ecological niches are concerned, you've got coyotes and you've got foxes in the same niche. If you had wolves, you wouldn't have any coyotes, because wolves and coyotes eat the same creatures. Wolves eat larger animals, but they also eat rabbits, just like coyotes do. And wolves will chase away coyotes. Once upon a time in a land far, far away, Montana, they decided that they were going to reintroduce wolves to control the deer and the elk population. They were having problems with the deer and the elk population. So they they reintroduced packs of wolves that they got from Canada. I'm not exactly sure how much it cost us to buy those wolves, but we bought wolves and we brought them down to Montana. And of course it was some wolf group that decided that they were going to reintroduce the wolf. So they reintroduced the wolves wolves are not really plains animals, they're mountain animals. So they put them in the Rocky Mountains. And of course they would range down into the plains and then they'd go run back up into the mountains to hide. The idea was that they were supposed to cull the elk herds because there were no natural predators for the elk that were alive. So they were trying to control the elk population by introducing the wolves. It's very logical. Wolves do eat elk. They really love elk. But as it turned out, of course, wolves are also will eat whatever is available. So, and of course, if you want to catch an elk, you've got to chase it down and grab it by the haunches and pull it down and whatnot. It's kind of dangerous. So the wolves, being really bright animals, decided, wait a minute, why in the world am I going to endanger myself by chasing down this elk? Why don't I just go eat a calf? They don't run hardly at all, and they really don't hurt us. So we'll just eat cows, we'll just eat beef. And they did, they ate beef. Where they could find sheep, sheep are even easier to kill. I mean, there's nothing a sheep can do to a wolf to fight off a wolf. How in the world does a sheep protect itself? How does a wolf protect itself? I'm sorry, how does a sheep protect itself? If you think about it.
Goes back into the herd.
Right, and that's exactly what they do. It's the mass. It's the mass, and that means that the guys on the outside get eaten by the wolves, and the guys in the middle are safe. So it's just that's the only defense they have is to mass, and that's not really a defense because they're going to eat the outside creatures. Okay, so that's what happened. The wolves started eating beef. They started eating sheep. They loved lambs. Some ranchers weren't getting any lambs any at all because the wolves were just snatching them as soon as they were born. They were snatching them, and of course that's pretty good eating for a wolf. The other problem they were having is that remember the wolves chase off the coyotes. Well, in that same niche are domesticated dogs. So they would kill wild dogs and nobody cared. The problem was that they'd go into people's yards and kill their pets. And that really pissed people off. So people, and of course you weren't allowed to shoot, you weren't supposed to shoot them unless they were attacking your herd or attacking your animals or something, or attacking your child. You could protect yourself that way. But you weren't supposed to kill these guys. And of course it didn't work very well at all. They tried to reintroduce them in Yellowstone. Of course, they just went all over the place. They just spread out from Yellowstone, and it was quite a mess. Anyway, so we have to look at ecological niches. Comparative studies may focus on specific differences between closely related species or may be concerned with general principles across larger groups, numbers of species, but in each case the use of evolutionary framework provides additional explanatory power. And that's exactly what I was just talking about. We're talking about eating ungulates. We're talking about controlling the deer population, controlling the elk population, and so they decided they would do that by reintroducing wolves into the area. Of course, that changed the ecological niche completely because what they were doing, instead of culling the wild animal population. They were actually culling the domestic animal population because they were easier to catch. They were easier to kill. Coyotes, of course, well, this is ranching up in Montana, but coyotes will wait for a cow to calf, and then they will either attack the calf and eat it, or they will eat the afterbirth, which sounds horrible, but I mean, it's just what you do, I guess, if you're a coyote. But the wolves would pull down the cow, and they would eat the calf right out of the cow. So it was a pretty ugly situation. The ranchers were pissed, really pissed, because all these tree huggers from back east were the ones that were reintroducing the wolves. And of course, they were the ones that got the law passed that they couldn't shoot them. But they shot them anyway. But they didn't, of course, now that the wolves have been reintroduced, they're filling that niche, but of course, they're causing a lot of trouble at the same time. For 5 years, if you lost any livestock, they would pay for your livestock. But after the 5 years, of course, they stopped paying for your livestock. And people were, like I said, they were losing all their lambs in a season. It was pretty ugly. It was just an ugly, ugly situation. And you couldn't talk to people because they would watch those stupid things on YouTube about how the wolves are such nice creatures, you know, and they've got a wolf sanctuary someplace where they pet the wolves and people can go out there and look at the wolves. You know. So they're looking at that and saying, this is what a wolf is like, but the reality is you put it out in nature and it fills that ecological niche and destroys anything that's in its path, anything that it can eat. And hopefully it's not a human. This is a classification of species of animals. This is mammalias, as you can see. Well, it's not all. They're not all mammals, are they? There's some birds and insects and rats. Well, rats are mammals. The principles of neural function revealed by comparative anatomy studies may often be generalized to many species, including humans. And of course, this is a picture that is looking at the sizes of brains in comparison. As you can see, a cat has a relatively interesting sized brain. Rats and humans have a lot in common. And we're going to talk about the commonalities between rats and humans. And as you can see, this is a monkey. It's not a chimpanzee, it's a monkey. It has a much smaller brain. All right. The major divisions of the brain are varied by all vertebrates. Are shared by all vertebrates. Brain differences between species of vertebrates. I'm getting sorry. Brain differences between species of vertebrates can often be directly related to their ecology and behavioral complexity. So it all depends on what they do and where they are as to how complex their brains are going to be. One of the things we know about the human brain, the more you use it, the larger it tends to be. If you look at a mathematician and compare it with an individual that is a relatively common laborer, the mathematician will have a much more complex brain than the individual that doesn't use their brain very much at all. So the more complex the environment, the rougher the schedule, the struggle for survival, the more likely the individual will have a very complex brain. Such differences tend to be quantitative in nature. Relative size of brain regions or the size of neurons is a good example. And of course, the human brain is much more complex than the grade 8 brain, which is the brain on the left is the grade 8 brain. And the brain on the right is the human brain. As you can see, there's far more complexity to the human brain. They've got actually the same areas in both brains, but the human brain is far more complex. As I said before, the modern human does not have the largest brain of all hominids that we've ever seen on Earth. The Neanderthal man actually had a much larger brain than we do. He had a larger brain than we have.
Now the question has to be, why didn't he survive and why in the world did we survive? Why did Homo sapiens sapiens survive and why didn't Neanderthal man survive? He had a bigger brain. His occipital lobe was larger. So why did we survive and they not survive? What was it about the Neanderthal man that didn't allow them to survive? What was it about Homo sapiens sapien that allowed them to survive over the Neanderthal man? They were both in Europe at the same time. And there are Neanderthal genes in people, not all people, but in some people. They found Neanderthal genes in Asians. They've certainly found Neanderthal genes in Europeans. So the question is, why didn't they survive and why did we survive? Nobody really has a definitive answer, but if they had a bigger brain, and they were more intelligent, did we have better weapons? Is that why we survived? Is it
like earlier when you explained that brain size and intelligence it's a small,
You're right.
but it's not really significant though.
Right.
So like the bigger the brain, it doesn't really correlate with how intelligent you really are.
It has to do with complexity of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the intelligence comes in. Could it be that modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens, are more violent than other humans? We're pretty damn violent. We've got a group of people that wanted to annihilate another group of human beings. Well, they almost annihilated Native Americans. English, wherever they went, they almost annihilated those populations, the native populations in those areas. They did that in Australia. They did it when they came to the Americas. They tried to annihilate the population. The Spanish weren't doing the same thing, but the Spanish were trying to enslave the population. They wanted them to find them gold. That's what they wanted, as confusing as that is. So the English have tried to exterminate populations, but the Nazis did exactly the same thing with the Jewish people. So we have a very violent group of individuals that seem to kill at will. And that seems to be their modus operandi, is killing as many people as they possibly can. I don't know if that's it or not. Nobody wants to talk about it. We kind of bounce over this like, my people never do anything wrong. I've looked at history, and history doesn't say anything about how violent we have always been. It's just a little bit confusing. Anyway, I have a feeling it has to do with violence, but I don't think anybody's ever going to say anything about that, because that means, I'm talking about my father, and I'm talking about my grandfather, and my great-grandfather, all these violent people that have tried to exterminate other individuals. Anyway, okay, the field of classifying animals is known as taxonomy. Taxonomy is an ongoing endeavor. Taxonomy can be done in many ways, including paleontology, studying fossil remains, comparing animal DNA with human DNA, and putting paleontological information with DNA analysis in a study called convergent evolution. If we look at, and I talked about this last time, if we look at chimpanzees and we look at humans, can humans and chimpanzees breed? I just looked this up just before class. It's called humanzee, is what they call it. Humanzee. Can humans and chimpanzees breed? They've tried to do this in the past. They've talked about it for centuries.
Can it happen?
No.
No, can't. We don't have the same number of, they have 48, we have 46 chromosomes. It doesn't they don't match up. There are places, and this is bestiality, and I hate to talk about this, but there are places where men use gorillas as prostitutes, as god-awful as that sounds, I know. And yeah, it's really kind of strange. Anyway, they do that, and they have not produced any offspring from, this mass raping of a female gorilla. Anyway, I know that's horrible, isn't it? Okay, so we know that we can't breed with that select animal. There are other animals with 46 chromosomes. So potentially, if a human had sex with one of these other animals with 46 chromosomes, potentially everything would match up and we would create an animal, a creature of one ilk or another, with 46 chromosomes. The probability isn't very high because they're ungulates. It's an ungulate. It's an antelope from Africa. So potentially, I mean, what's the probability that that's going to happen? If you give people the idea, they'll try it. The Russians tried to breed chimpanzees and humans, and it didn't work. They were trying to create a hybrid to use as soldiers. This is in the 1920s, after the Russian Revolution. Of course, all bets were off at that stage. They were trying to match the two groups of individuals. He's going to go throw up, I have a feeling. This is really kind of tragic. Two of the fastest swimmers in the ocean are tuna and dolphins. Each evolved for efficient swimming, and so there are similarities in their structure. However, the dolphin, of course, is a mammal, and the tuna is a fish. I know, but there are similarities between the two of them. They were put together in order to swim fast. As you can see, the dolphin tail is horizontal, and the tuna fins are vertical. Other than that, they're shaped a lot alike. They're both torpedo-shaped. Similar features due to convergent evolution is called homoplasy. Similar development, and that's the tuna and the dolphin. And the sad thing is that sometimes dolphin are caught with tuna and canned as tuna. So sometimes when you open up your, king of the sea or whatever your tuna fish is, that possibly you're not eating tuna at all, you're eating dolphin. That's a possibility, unfortunately. Homology is a study of similarities. It looks at similarities between body structures of animals with common ancestry. A good example of homology is the forelimb of several mammals. If we look at the forelimb of the human, of course, this is, you've got a hand, you've got a forearm, and you've got the upper arm. If we look at a dog's foreleg, we see exactly the same structure. If we look at a seal, despite the fact it doesn't look anything like an arm, we have exactly the same structures. And the wing of a bat has exactly the same bones in it that the human arm has. Classification of species begins in general terms and runs to be more and more specific. Kingdom is the most general term. Living creatures are broken into 5 kingdoms: Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, Monera, which is bacteria, and Protista. Protista are single-cell animals like amoeba. Of course, we have bacteria, funguses, plants, and animals, and those are the 5 basic kingdoms of animal. The main subdivision of a kingdom is a phylum. There are 3 phylums: Chordata, Mollusca, and Anthropoda. Chordata, of course, are us. Mollusks are those animals that live in the water, and Arthropoda are animals such as insects and spiders. The main subdivision of a phylum is a class. Some classes within the phylum of Chordata are Mammalia, Aves, and Reptilia. Mammalia, of course, are mammals, Aves are birds, and Reptilia are reptiles. The main subdivision of a class is an order. Some orders within the class of Mammalia, Carnivora, Herbivora, and Primates. Carnivora would be dogs and cats. Herbivores would be ungulates like deer and elk. And primates are us, and monkeys and great apes, including the chimpanzee, which is a great ape. The main subdivision of the order is the family such as Canidae and Felidae. Canidae are dogs, of course, and Felidae are cats. The main subdivision of a family is the genus, such as Canis and Vulpes. Vulpes are foxes, and Canis are dogs or wolves. The main subdivision of a genus is a species such as Canis familiaris, anyway. Domesticated dogs, familiaris, wow. While Darwin's theory was widely accepted, no one really knew or understood how change took place until the biologist Hugo de Vries. He showed that mutations do occur. He was working with primroses, and he showed that mutations were fairly spontaneous. Once upon a time, of course I've been around for a really long time. For some reason my mother was really obsessed with grapefruit. So we had a lot of grapefruit while I was growing up. Grapefruit used to have a lot of seeds in them while I was growing up. And then somebody developed a grapefruit without any seeds. Now the problem with grapefruit without any seeds is that you don't have any way of replanting them because you don't have any seeds to plant. But of course it's a mutation. And now it's really very difficult to find a grapefruit with seeds. This is a ruby red, of course. And this is the way they used to look, and this is the way they look now. So if you ever buy a grapefruit and cut into it, the probability of finding seeds is fairly remote. You may find little tiny mutated seeds, which don't grow, of course. But in the old days, you'd find 15 or 20 of them. It was almost like there was no pulp. It was all seeds. So you'd have to pick the seeds out before you could eat them. So my family are grapefruit eaters, as odd as that sounds. Genetic studies subsequently demonstrated that chromosomes provided the building blocks of inheritance. Later, genes were identified as building blocks of chromosomes. Watson and Crick, and this is Watson and Crick in the right order. Watson's on the left and Crick's on the right. They demonstrated that DNA was arranged in a double helix made up of nucleic acid. So what you do is you get the sex cells of the body, the ova of the female, the sperm of the male, each have 23 chromosomes. They will form, they will match together in the double helix structure, and they will form a single chromosome, 46 chromosomes. And that's why you are the product of your mother and father, your mother's ova, your father's sperm. Each had 23 chromosomes. They got together and they made the people that you are today, of course. Anyway, that's the way it works. So the double helix gets together and it forms, it matches up. Now, one of the interesting things about DNA, about chromosomes, is that you have dominant traits and you have recessive traits. The reason your hair is the color as it is, maybe because of your mother or your father, whichever one had different colored hair. Your eye color is the same way. Your skin tone is the same way. Your height is the same way. You may take after your maternal grandfather or your great-great-great-grandfather or your great-great-great-grandmother. Really all depends. You may be the only person in your family that is tall or the only person in your family that's short. How does this work out? Because someplace back in your ancestry there was a recessive trait that followed the DNA came to you from that select individual. That's the way she works. Today, the Modern Genome Project gives us an ever-expanding view of the makeup of humans as compared to other creatures, and this is what the genome looks like. There are billions and billions of connections that we look at. The reality is that all humans have about the same DNA. If we're looking at an individual's DNA, 99.5% of it is identical to everybody else's. So when you do a DNA study, if you're trying to find a criminal and you have a DNA sample and you're looking at that, you don't have to look at all the entire DNA structure. All you have to look at is that 0.5%. That's all you have to look at. The rest of it is exactly the same as everybody else. If you go to heritage.com or there are other groups that will look at your DNA, they really don't look at very much of your DNA, but what they're looking for are markers. So of course you guys are all Dene, so you don't have to worry about this. I mean, if you did a DNA study, it would all be very similar. But as a European, as somebody that's been in the United States, you know, my ancestors have been here for 300 or 400 years, and potentially have mixed with lots and lots of different people. You know, me looking at my DNA is really quite curious. You've seen those advertisements on television of the lady that had no idea who she was, and she's always told everybody that she was Hispanic, and then she had a DNA study done, and she discovered she was 26% American Indian. And of course, that's always curious to me. Okay, so that's your ancestry, but you grew up as, you know, some white chick someplace. So what's the problem? Or the lady, the African American lady who puts on the hat and she recognizes herself as one of these Africans. No, not really, because you're an African American lady, you're not African. Just because you wear a hat doesn't make, just because you wear a headdress doesn't make you an Indian. It's not the way the world works. Your culture has to do with how you grow up. So you can't just adopt somebody's culture. You can't adopt a culture. It would be like me deciding that I wanted to be, you know, Lithuanian. So all of a sudden I start wearing Lithuanian clothes and I speak Lithuanian and I eat Lithuanian food. Does that make me a Lithuanian? No, I'll never be a Lithuanian because it's not part of my culture and it's also not part of my heritage. Anyway, it just really kind of odd to me that people are trying to change their identities by their heritage. Right? You guys grew up in this culture, so this is your culture. What if you found out that you're actually not Dene at all? That you're, I don't know, Cherokee or Chickasaw? Are you suddenly going to change the way you dance at powwows? Because you guys don't dance at powwows, but they do. So all of a sudden you'd start dancing at powwows and put on, you know, purple clothes and an orange headdress and start doing fancy dances or something. I don't know. None of it makes any sense to me. Look at the melons on those chicks. Look at that. Look how big their heads are. Look how tiny this guy's head is. Isn't that sad? We have two melon heads there, and then we have a pinhead up on top. Researchers have determined that species who have to hunt for their food, such as humans and carnivores, have bigger brains than animals that don't have to search for their food. I mean, if you're a deer, you know, you're wandering along the trail and you can just nibble on whatever you want to nibble on, but as humans, of course, we can't nibble on grass, we can't digest grass very well. So we can't do that, we have to find our food, and since we have to find our food, our brains are huge because we're looking for food. We have to have the right food, and we have to have the right vitamins and whatnot. So our heads are as big as melons. That's why our brains are so large, because we have to find our blueberry muffins and our orange juice and our bacon and eggs, we have to find it. We have to find the chickens so that we can eat their eggs, and we have to not only slaughter the pigs, but we also have to process the meat so that it becomes bacon. Where do you find oranges? At the store, of course. But what if we wanted to make ourselves orange juice from the tree? Where can you find a tree? Are there orange trees around here? We'd have to fly to Florida. The area in the world with the most orange trees is Belize, as odd as that sounds. And people in Florida complain about it all the time. Too much of our orange juice is coming from Belize, they say. As strange as that is. But if you're a deer, you don't even have to worry about it. If you're an ungulate, you can just eat the grass. I don't know what you guys are feeding your sheep. I don't see any grass around here. What the hell do they eat? There's not that much grass. There is some grass. Not a whole lot. The more novel the means of obtaining food, the larger the forebrain of the animal. Magpies have been known to dig up potatoes, which is pretty smart. If you think about it, house sparrows have been seen picking insects from the car radiator grills. Crows have been known to drop rock-hard palm nuts in front of cars so that they will run over them and open them. Birds who have to store food will have a larger hippocampus than birds that don't, because they have to remember where they put their food. The hippocampus is necessary, of course, for your memory. Thus, the larger one is needed for those species that rely on memory for survival. The acorn woodpecker, which is the guy on the left. The Clark's nutcracker is the guy down below. And the black-capped chickadee is the guy up in the right-hand corner. These are animals that store food, so they have to remember where they put the food. So they have larger hippocampi than other animals that don't have to remember where they put their food. But these guys do, so they have bigger hippocampi than other animals. The differences between the brains of humans and the brains of other mammals are mostly quantitative. Are mostly quantitative. Rats and humans are similar in that each has a brain that represents about 2% of the total body weight. And for that reason, we do a lot of studies with rats. That and the fact that nobody really gives a rat's ass how many rats you kill. We don't care. If we saw one scurrying along the wall, we would probably try to kill it anyway. So, I mean, who cares if you kill a rat, right? We can butcher all the rats we want. We can do all the experiments with rats, and there are very few people going, "Oh my God, don't kill the rats. They're so cute." Oh, I hate rats. The basic differences have mostly to do with the size of the cerebrum of the human and the prominent increase in the surface due to the gyri and the sulci. And that's the complexity that I was talking about before. The smarter you are, the larger, more surface area that you have of your brain. You have more gyri and sulci. And as humans, of course, we have much larger brains than just about any other species. This is looking at a human brain and looking at a rat's brain. And as you can see, we have lots of surface area because of all the gyri and sulci. And the rat doesn't have that. So the rat's not quite as bright as we are. But the reality is a rat will figure out how to get into something that we are trying to keep them from getting into because he is hungrier than we are. He has survival on his mind, and we need to keep that rat out of our food on our minds. Rats don't miss out completely. They have a much larger olfactory bulb
than humans, and so have a much stronger sense of smell, so they can smell just about anything, they can detect things, and that is how they find their food. The nervous system of vertebrates have several similarities. They develop from hollow dorsal neural tube. They show bilateral symmetry. Segmentation is present. Pairs of spinal nerves extend from each level of the spinal cord, and it's very symmetrical. That's why we don't just hop around on one leg, because our other leg doesn't work very well. We have symmetry, so we can walk fairly well. Our right side is just as strong as our left side, so we have symmetry. The central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system are separate. Localization is present. Certain functions are controlled by certain locations in the central nervous system. Anthropologists and comparative biologists assume that all vertebrates have these features in common because they descended from common ancestors. And of course, this is relatively controversial. This is one of those things that some people argue about, is does evolution exist? Invertebrates are another story, of course. There are 17 phyla to cover the invertebrates, while vertebrates are part of just one. So we evolved from a proto-structure, from one structure. And of course, we all have very similar structures, and that's one of the reasons why when we were thinking about going into outer space, we didn't experiment with humans, we experimented with other mammals. We could do that because they had a similar immune system as us, they had a similar respiratory system as us. So when I was working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they were doing research for NASA, dealing with going into outer space, they weren't working with humans, they were working with dogs, they were working with beagles. And the reason they were working with beagles is because beagles had a very similar immune system, very similar respiratory system as humans. So they were working with these creatures. Why the beagle and not the Labrador Retriever? I have no idea. It was just they discovered that beagles were closer to humans than any other species of dog, I'm guessing, because that's what they used, and they wouldn't use it. And they had to be purebred beagles. They couldn't be a beagle that had a basset hound mother or whatever. It had to be a purebred beagle. And like I told you before, I had a friend that he was the one that euthanized these dogs, and he was Laguna. He's from Laguna, Puebla. Married to a Kiowa. He was a really cool guy. And like I said, he was going to make me a pair of moccasins, and they weren't shoes. They came all the way up to your knee. I mean, they were moccasins. He told me what I needed to do was get him kill a deer and skin it and tan the hide. And of course, at the time, there weren't any deer in Ohio. That's kind of odd, but we didn't have any deer at that time. So what else is happening? It has been estimated that every human on Earth, there are over 1 billion insects for each human on Earth. So there are a lot of insects out there. One of the things I noticed this past summer is we didn't have hardly any gnats. We didn't have any mosquitoes up in Iowa. Now normally we have lots of gnats, we have lots of mosquitoes. But this year we didn't. And I'm just wondering if they didn't try to eradicate all the mosquitoes because of the Zika virus. They were afraid of an outbreak of Zika virus this summer. So they killed off all the mosquitoes and all the gnats. I saw helicopters flying around and I couldn't figure out what was going on. We normally don't have that helicopters spraying the fields, but this year we did. They weren't crop dusters, because crop dusters are, those little yellow planes that dust the crops. These were helicopters, and they were federal helicopters. I couldn't figure out what was going on. So what would happen if we killed off all the mosquitoes? What happens next? Can we do that? We've talked about it. Is there anything negative that would happen? We wouldn't be bitten nearly as much. I mean, mosquitoes spread a lot of diseases. Is there any negative thing that would happen if we kill off all the mosquitoes? Should we be happy that there were hardly any mosquitoes this year?
Well, every action has a reaction,
It just
so
does.
I don't know what exactly what they supply to the earth and everything, what they do here, but yeah, there would be some
Everything
kind
has a
of.
reaction, you're absolutely correct. So what happens to the bats that eat all your mosquitoes? Now they've got nothing to eat. So we're starving out all the bats. Okay, so we lose bats. Who cares? What do bats do for us besides eat mosquitoes? We don't have any mosquitoes, we don't need the bats, right? What about the barn swallows? Now we don't have barn swallows either because they eat the mosquitoes as well. Wow, we're killing off this whole group of animals that eat the insects. But the insects also, some of them, pollinate our plants. And if we don't have these insects to pollinate our plants, now we got a really serious problem. So all that corn that we grow, all of a sudden we're not getting any pollination taking place. We don't have any more apples because apples are usually pollinated by bees, and we've got no bees. So what? Okay. Anyway, it gets kind of ugly. Insects spread a lot of diseases. Yes, that is true. But without the insects, we've got a really serious problem. The basic plan, all vertebrates and most invertebrates share a basic plan that consists of a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. Whether you're a grasshopper or a human, you've got a peripheral nervous system and a central nervous system. And of course, if you've ever chopped into a grasshopper or stepped on one, you can see all the interesting structures. They don't look like humans at all. All vertebrates and many invertebrates, including mollusks and insects, have brains. The general evolutionary trend in both vertebrates and invertebrates is toward increasing brain control over ganglia at lower levels of the body. And of course, that is the brain of a human. Well, it's a brain of a cartoon character, and the other is the brain of a grasshopper, once again. And as you can see, they both have brains. Of course, that's a little Stewie, if I remember correctly. Okay. He's quite bright, and he has an English accent, which is kind of odd because his mother has a New York accent or something. Axons of mammalians' neurons are surrounded by myelin, which helps them conduct impulses faster. Invertebrates have no myelin to speed nerve conduction. Of course, they're relatively small creatures. So do they really need myelin to accelerate their nerve impulses? And the answer is obviously not, or they would have developed it also. If we look at present creatures and their fossilized ancestors, we can see that the brain has changed over time, whether it is the bird's brain or a hominid brain. And of course, there are all of the brains that I've been talking about. Is Neanderthal man in there? No, Neanderthal man's not there. For the longest time, we weren't exactly sure if Neanderthal man was in our ancestry, in our heritage, because we had never identified, we were never able to identify the Neanderthal man in modern man. But now, of course, now that we can do DNA studies, we have found some DNA structures of Neanderthal man, and we do realize that there are some humans that have Neanderthal ancestry or heritage. And as you can see, the skull certainly has changed over time. This is a proto ape, and of course this is modern man, Homo sapien. And we can see this by comparing the different structures in the skull. And there we are again. As you can see, the Neanderthal man does have a large occipital lobe. It is larger than modern man, Neanderthal skull. If a Neanderthal man walked into the room, we would go, wow, that guy's pretty powerful. But he would look just like us, kind of. Well, just like me anyway. I have an uncle that looks just like Neanderthal man. I had an uncle, he's gone now. But as you can see, they have not a much larger brain, but a larger brain than modern humans do. Are they as attractive as we were? Were they as attractive as we are? And the answer is they looked a lot like us, as confusing as that may be. And as you can see, they're talking about the sizes of their brains. This is a chimpanzee, the gorilla, A. robustus, A. habilis, A. erectus. This is Neanderthal man. As you can see, his brain is actually larger than modern man. On the average, this is on the average, of course. Once upon a time they decided that they were going to look at people's brains and try to determine who had the biggest brain. This was mostly an argument between the Germans and the French. The Germans thought they were the smartest people. The French knew that they were the smartest people. So they decided that they were going to measure people's brains. And what they discovered was some people have really big melon heads and some people have kind of tiny little pinheads. And intelligence doesn't have anything to do with brain size. Males have larger brains than females do, on the average. But males are bigger than females, so this makes sense. This is very logical. Does that mean that they're smarter? No, it doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. So they were looking at brains and trying to determine if Germans were smarter than the French, if Germans had bigger brains than the French people did. So they had all of these individuals who donated their brains to science. You've heard, they talk about donating your brain to science. Well, that's what was going on. And they were weighing them and they were measuring them, trying to figure out who had the biggest brains. And at the same time, they were trying to figure out which group around the world had the biggest brains. Thinking, of course, that Europeans would come in first. That's why they were trying to prove that Europeans were superior. This is back in the 19th century. So they were taking skulls that they found and they were filling them up with BBs to find out which ones were the largest ones. And they took them from all over the place. They found ancient Chinese people and they looked at their skulls. They looked at people from the Arctic regions and they looked at their skulls. They looked at people from the plains of Africa. They looked at people from South America. They looked at people from Australian Aborigines. They looked at Egyptians and modern Egyptians and ancient Egyptians that they found their skulls. They looked at Hottentots down in South Africa. So they measured everybody's brains, and guess who came out on top? I talk about this all the time. Guess who won? Guess who had the biggest brain? Was it the Europeans like they wanted it to be? Did those guys really have the biggest brains? Was it the Germans? Well, actually, the French were doing this because they were trying to prove that they're more sophisticated than the Germans are. So obviously, they have a bigger brain. Did they have the biggest brains? Hell no, they didn't have the biggest brains, and they were pissed. Guess who had the biggest skulls, biggest brains? Any guesses? Eskimos. The Eskimos had the biggest brains. I know. Why? Why would they have bigger heads than everybody else? Does that make any sense? Why would Eskimos need a bigger brain than anybody else? Well, Neanderthals have bigger brains too. But why in the world would Eskimos have bigger brains? So it pissed them off. You know how Europeans are. They get proved wrong and they get pissed off. So they decided that, wait a minute, let's look at evolution. If we look at gorillas have a long upper arm and a short forearm. So what we'll do is, so that means that the closer the ratio between their forearm and their upper arm, the more evolved people are. So they went around the world measuring the upper arm and the forearm of humans. And guess who came out on top? This is one they thought that they had it socked, but as it turned out, it didn't work out that way. They didn't come in first again. Damn it. They were so upset. Guess who had the best ratio between their forearm and their upper arm? Eskimos again, damn it. So obviously they must be the most evolved humans on Earth. So what the hell are they doing way up there? It's cold up there. It's hard to survive. So why in the world would they have big heads and short arms? Does that make any sense? Why would they have short arms? Why would they have such huge heads and no necks? They've got no necks. They're all hunched up like this. So what's with the Eskimos? So we don't call them Eskimos anymore. We refer to them by their tribal grouping, the Aleuts and the Inuits. So why did these guys, and there were actually Athabascans up there, but they're tall and much more slender than the Eskimos are, than the Aleuts and the Inuits. So what's going on?
Could be adaptability.
Yes, exactly. They adapted to the cold. And the best way to adapt to the cold is to stay as close to your torso as possible. So their arms are these little tiny things. Well, they're not really that tiny, but they're shorter. Their arms are shorter. And of course, they've got no necks because they need to stay as warm as they possibly can. It's really cold up there. And their heads are big because, well, they don't want to lose, they want to maintain as much heat as possible. So the larger the head, well, anyway. So that's what they figured out. Of course, the Europeans are just upset, and of course they're not coming up with this. It took until the 1960s until we realized what was going on. But for the longest time, they're not saying that Eskimos are more evolved than anybody else. But what they're saying is these guys, we can't measure skulls anymore because of the Eskimos, damn it, they always win. We can't measure arms anymore because the Eskimos always win. Anyway. What are we doing? Oh, we're looking at total brain volume. Is it time? No. Total brain volume, and as you can see, modern humans have a much larger volume. Cubic centimeters, 1,252 cubic centimeters, as compared to 88 for a rhesus monkey, 7.2 cubic centimeters for a lemur, and a tree shrew, which has a very large brain, has only 3 cubic centimeters of brain tissue. Anyway, so we've got big brains. We're big-headed people. Well, Eskimos are big-headed people. This is everybody off. I had a student at Belknap who was a Inuit. She was Inuit. She was really smart, except the whole crystal meth thing kind of messed her up. But other than the crystal meth thing, she was really smart. Okay, what's the next chapter about? Lifespan development of the brain and behavior. No pictures. Really, no pictures? I didn't put any. Oh, there's some pictures. Okay. All right. Let's see what we've got here. Oh, we're going to develop it. We're going to make a baby. That's going to be exciting. The brain. The human brain is very large. The brain contains about 100 billion neurons and an equal number of glial cells. I've got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to just get into this. It is estimated that there may be as many as 100 trillion connections within the brain. Are you really that cold? I'm so sorry. While genetics play an important role in creating the brilliant creatures that each and every one of us may be, the environment guides the process of development. So it's wherever you are, it's whatever you do in life. And of course, I've done everything and been everywhere, so it's really kind of exciting inside my head because I've seen lots and lots of things. You've seen lots and lots of things too. You've been lots of places. You've been more places than, no, you haven't. But you did different things. Well, I'm trying to save everybody's life and you're not.
You got to enjoy.
I enjoy, exactly. I enjoyed the military. Well, I didn't really enjoy it at all. Yeah, they stuck me in a cave for a week and I almost went insane along with everybody else. While genetics play an important role in creating the brilliant creatures that each, I already talked about that. The most rapid brain growth is during gestation, of course, but it continues to expand markedly through the language acquisition years. So our brain continues to grow until we get into puberty. Our brain is really expanding rapidly. So if you've got a little guy, you have a newborn baby, his skull just, you can't buy hats for him because his head just keeps getting larger and larger and larger. You have to buy new clothes for him all the time. In my family, it's feet. We have to buy new shoes like every 6 months because our feet are just expanding. I mean, it's weird. Most people, their feet grow at a relatively normal rate, but my family, I mean, 12 for somebody that's 5'6", that's crazy. That's insane. That makes no sense whatsoever. For an egg to be fertilized and come to term, everything has to be perfect. So the reality is that when we make a baby, when a baby is made, everything has to be perfect. Now this really seems kind of strange because you've got those 15 and 16-year-old girls that are having sex one time and doggone it, they get knocked up every damn time. Seems like that's the way it works. Why would that happen? Why would such a young person have a baby get pregnant? It seems to me like that the human body would wait until you're in your 20s before you could get pregnant. So why at 15 and 16? Why are these little girls getting pregnant so readily? Their ovulation is longer. As it turns out, their ovulation is longer. The other thing that it turns out to be, in order for humans to reproduce, of course, we have to have sex at the right moment, at the right time. And of course, the right moment is over a 24 to 48 hour period. You have to have sex at the right moment. And of course, that's ovulation. And ovulation tells you when you are viable, when you can possibly get pregnant. So that's when you do it. That's when you're most likely to do it. That's when you want to do it more than any other time. So that's the way the human body works. And the younger you are, the less control, I guess I can say control, the less control you have over things. So the more likely you are to have sex at the wrong moment. Some women get pregnant and they only have sex once. One time they had sex and they got knocked up. How does that work? Well, that's how it works. The human body wants to get pregnant. Later on, of course, and the other thing is that the younger you are, the more you're processing information through your amygdala. That is your emotional section of your brain. So the younger you are, the less control you have over this. As you get older, of course, you start processing information. All the information that's coming in is going through your prefrontal cortex, so you're thinking about things before you react to them. But when you're a young person, like in your 13, 14, 15 years, at that age, you're processing everything through your emotional section of your brain. So you're more likely to react emotionally. And for that reason, you're not thinking, oh, geez, if I have sex right now, I'm going to get pregnant. You're not thinking about that, you're thinking emotions. You're just thinking emotions. So yes, of course, they are more likely to get pregnant, as confusing as that is. The sperm must have its full complement of 23 chromosomes and will not be able to swim through the cervix, up through the uterus and into the fallopian tube to penetrate the ova unless everything is perfect. Now the reality is that at most times during the month, a female cannot get pregnant, because there's a mucal plug that covers the cervix and the sperm can't get through. But during ovulation, that mucal plug liquefies and it's more likely that sperm can get up through the cervix. So that's what's going on here. In order to get pregnant, of course, the mucal plug has to go away and the sperm have to swim up into the uterus and then up into the fallopian tubes, and then the impregnation takes place. The ovum must have its full complement of 23 chromosomes and be in the right position when the sperm reaches it. And that's usually just after ovulation, just after the ova has been has gone into the fallopian tube from the ovary. That's when it needs to be impregnated. The fallopian tube is relatively large and the ova is relatively small. So as the impregnation takes place, the cell division will start at about 24 hours, and of course this whole time the ova is migrating, or the fetus now it's a zygote.
It's moving down the fallopian tube. So it has to move out of the fallopian tube. If it gets stuck in the fallopian tube, we got a problem, because it's going to continue to grow. And the fallopian tube is only a select size. So what will happen is if it gets stuck in the fallopian tube, then you'll have what they call an ectopic pregnancy. And it will expand until it destroys the fallopian tube, it explodes the fallopian tube. And that's not a good thing. Okay. So what if this happened on a frequent basis? For one thing, women wouldn't want to get pregnant because they'd be afraid of an ectopic pregnancy. And another thing is that sometimes it causes hemorrhaging in the fallopian tube, and they can actually bleed to death from an ectopic pregnancy. And it's also excruciatingly painful. I've never had one, of course, but I've been around when people had one. We need to stop right now, but let me tell you a really quick story. It's not really a story. My second wife had an ectopic pregnancy. This is not when I was married to her, of course, but it was later on. And I will tell you the whole story of my second wife, who actually couldn't get pregnant until they did surgery and fixed her fallopian tube. So, and then they didn't fix it completely, so it was kind of a mess. She's one of those individuals that could not get pregnant. And she wanted to really bad. She was looking for the guy that could get her pregnant, by golly, and it wasn't me. I tried, but she had a problem, and of course we didn't have enough. Anyway, okay, well, I'll see you guys next time. Thank you, sir. I'll see you on Tuesday of next week.